Hi and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for the Cobramite Maneuver, which is episode 10, Asterix, of season 1 of Star Trek The Original Series. This video is part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as determined by my user polls. The episode to win my latest user poll for the original series was the Cobramite Maneuver. So the Cobramite Maneuver is the episode in which Enterprise encounters a vast alien spaceship that overpowers them and traps them and promises to destroy them for invading their space. So Kirk bluffs his way out of it by coming up with a made-up substance called Corbomite, which supposedly destroys any ship that attacks them. And this manages to buy Kirk enough time to maneuver out of the situation, overpower the alien ship, and they find that the ship is disabled and in danger. So Kirk beams over to help them, only to find that it's just some weird looking alien that looks like a little kid that was just testing them the whole time, and then they end up having peaceful relations. So, the asterisks. First, let me address the asterisks, and that's when I said episode 10 of season 1. I actually think of this as episode 2 of season 1, and I'll tell you why. So episode 10 refers to the air date, when this was the 10th episode to air on NBC in the 60s when the show came out. However, it was I would say third episode actually produced for the original series, if you include the first failed pilot, The Cage. So it's the second episode produced that actually had William Shatner as Kirk, and so it is the first, in fact, episode that was made after Star Trek was greenlit, and they knew that it was going to air on television. And I think that's actually significant. And one of these days, if I ever, and I am going to do this eventually. In fact, you might be watching this in the future when I've already had. But one of these days, I will cover Star Trek The Original Series in its entirety, doing one season at a time like I have done for every other Star Trek show so far. I've just been procrastinating as far as the original series goes. To be honest, I don't like the original series as much as the other ones. I'm sorry, I just can't get over the 60s-ness of it. But if I ever do that, which I will, I am going to go by production order, not air date, because it makes more sense, because especially in the first season, and actually it's mainly just the first season where the order is completely jumbled. Later seasons, I think it's fine. They kind of aired it as they made it. But for some reason, especially this first set of episodes, they show completely out of order. Like, Mantrap infamously was the first episode ever aired, but it certainly was not the first episode produced. And it's funny because when I used to watch the original series as a teenager in the 90s, when they showed it on reruns, they would go from production date. In fact, when they had the VHSs, which I would get sometimes, they had the ordered number was according to production date. But sometime between then and like the 2000s, when they started releasing the DVD collections and then the streaming services started to come out, they all of a sudden switched to air date. So the DVDs had it listed towards air date, and if you go on Netflix or CBS All Access, I guess it's Paramount Plus now, whatever, or Amazon or whatnot, what have you, they show it according to air date now. Which I gotta be honest, I disagree with that. And here's why. If anyone's ever seen the show Firefly or is familiar with the show Firefly, I would use that as an analogy why showing it according to production date makes a lot more sense as according to air date. I mean, generally speaking, there are exceptions like this, like Unification in Next Generation. Unification 2 was filmed before Unification 1, and that had to do with Leonard Nimoy's schedule. So you wouldn't show Part 2 before you showed Part 1. That's just common sense. So in that case, you would go by air date. But for the most part, And I think it makes a lot more sense to go by production date. And as I said, fans of the show Firefly will know why, because that show actually tells a coherent story where stuff in earlier episodes affects stuff in later episodes. Even though each episode's pretty much standalone, there is still background character stuff that are ongoing stories. And for some reason, and this is a lot of people actually attribute to why the show failed when it first aired and didn't find success until later, until it was released on DVD, was because Fox showed it completely out of order, and so the order was completely jumbled and didn't make any sense. Now, some people may say, well, okay, I see what you see by Firefly, because you do have a story progression that's completely mixed up and doesn't make sense when you show it out of order. Well, Mark, this is Star Trek, the original series we're talking about here, that aired in the 60s, and every episode was completely episodic, so it doesn't really make any difference if you show it out of order. Well, I would strongly disagree with that, particularly because the original series, especially in its first set of early episodes, which is the parts that completely jumbled and shown out of order, they didn't really know they didn't have their complete cast of characters, or they didn't really know what they were doing. They were kind of learning as they were going, basically. So you have Mantrap as number one. I can't remember what other episodes they showed before this, but there's 9 other episodes that they showed before this one, and it doesn't make any sense to do it that way, because especially when I rewatch this episode in particular, I can see that this is where they're really they're finally finding their feet and finding out who the crew is and what the relationships are. So just for context, this is the first episode McCoy was filmed to be in. This is the first one they made that McCoy was in. This is the first one they made that Sulu was the helmsman. This is the first one they made that Uhura was in. You can actually tell that by watching. Like, I can tell that by watching this episode, that they're kind of introducing these characters. They're introducing, oh, this is McCoy, he's the doctor, he has this relationship with Kirk. This is Sulu, he's the helmsman who gets really excited and loves to count down stuff. This is Uhura, and she's wearing a yellow shirt in this episode because they still hadn't figured that part out. And she's, makes the phone calls or whatnot. and it feels like an introduction episode. Mantrap does not. Mantrap feels like you already know who McCoy is, you already know who Sulu is, and the reason why is because it was made after this episode. And after later episodes, and plus, not to mention, they showed Where No Man Has Gone Before. I can't remember what order number they showed it in, but it was much later. And that is very jarring if you try to watch it as according to air date, because then all of a sudden you have totally different characters, they're acting differently, they're wearing different shirts, you're missing other characters. Sulu's like a scientist instead of a helmsman. It makes zero sense. It makes a hell of a lot more sense, and I think that is why in the 90s syndication, according to VHS, they did show it according to production date, because it's like if you showed Firefly as according to air date, nobody does that. Absolutely. DVDs, streaming service, because why would you? Because it makes no sense. So why did they do it to the original series then? I think it's the same concept applies here, that it makes zero sense to show it as according to air date. I think the main reason I think they do so is nostalgia. It's because for people who were alive or who first saw it, it was like, oh, we didn't see, back in my day, we didn't see Where No Man Has Gone Before first. We saw Mantrap first. So I think that's why they did it, to satisfy that nostalgia. But it actually, has a storytelling, it's a progressive storytelling. And as episodic as the original series is, there still is some background knowledge of the audience knowing these characters and how these characters interact with each other that progresses from episode to episode. And if you watch it completely out of order as according to air date, then it makes no sense, and that story just jumbled and fucked up. Whereas if you watch it as according to production as according to when the episodes were actually created, written, and filmed, then that progression is a lot steadier and makes a lot more sense. So, I know I'm kind of not even talking about the episode yet, but I think that's something that this episode in particular made me think of a lot. Because this is the second episode. I don't care what the fucking air date is, and that's why I put the asterisk. I had to go episode 10 because I've been doing air dates so far. But I don't care what the hell the air date is, what people say episode 10, what Netflix says, IMDb says. This is episode 2. And that's what I noticed when I watched this. I mean, and you could even say episode 3 if you want to throw the cage in there, but that's a whole nother ball of wax, which, that was a failed pilot that wasn't picked up. Okay, but this was the second episode ever made after the show was actually picked up. Well, no, it was the first episode ever made after it was picked up, because Where No Man Had Gone Before was also a pilot. But basically, I consider that the first episode. This is the second episode. The cage is kind of its own thing. Yeah. So, and I don't care what anyone ever said. In fact, whenever anyone mentions this episode, whenever I see it brought up, I'm like, oh, it's episode number 2. Instantly. And it is! Watching it again really drives it home that this is the second episode of the show where the thing was really finding its footing. I don't care what anyone else fucking said. All right, so what episodes did they air before? So I want to see the air date. Man Trap was shown first, then Charlie X, then Where No Man Has Gone Before, then The Naked Time, then The Enemy Within, then Mud's Women, and then What Little Girls Are Made Of, and Miri, Dagger of the Mind, then Cobramite Maneuver. What? Like, Dagger of the Mind, Miri, and What Little Girls Are Made Of were filmed, like, way after. This is completely out of order. I reject that order wholeheartedly. Sorry. I've gone on about that enough, so let's talk about this episode. Now, I've always liked this episode. As I said, I think, and again, because it's the second episode, it comes off as a bit more cheesy. Because, well, even for the original series, because they were just finding their footing. And in fact, I found that most Star Trek shows, and maybe this doesn't apply here because this is in the 60s when I'm talking about the ones in the 90s, the second episode tends to be very terrible. It tends to be kind of boring. It tends to be because the pilots were like, oh, they introduce everything. But the second episode is them attempting to sort of normalize it while still trying to introduce and get you used to some of these characters. The Naked Now was the second episode for Next Generation. My God, did that ever suck. Deep Space Nine, second episode was Past Prologue, which was an okay episode, but I didn't really like it that much. They completely changed the whole dynamic of Bajor and Kira later on in the series because what they presented in that episode didn't really work. So again, it was them trying to find their footing. And the second episode of Voyager was, I can't even remember the name of it. It was such a throwaway, boring episode about some stupid anomaly bullshit while Janeway was trying to figure out who she's going to make chief engineer. And a lot of people point to that as the worst episode, one of the worst episodes of Voyager. I disagree. I wouldn't go that far because I actually thought some of the character interactions between Janeway and Torres worked, but the main plot with the throwaway anomaly was definitely bull. And again, it was the show trying to find its footing. And then the second episode of Enterprise, of course, that whole thing was a disaster. So I think it was Strange New World, which was terrible, just like the entire first season of Enterprise was. Anyway, so anyway, I do notice that it does sort of, and you also notice in this episode that Kirk refers to, doesn't say Starfleet or the Federation. Of course, the United Federation of Planets wasn't first introduced until the episode Taste of Armageddon, which, let me look it up. I know it was much, much later in the season. It's like towards the end of season 1, episode 23. And that's when the air date and production dates were pretty much the same. And so, in this episode, he refers to as like the Earth Alliance. I can't remember the exact, and it's funny because the name of the aliens that they encounter is the something the Federation, which is a bit confusing. But they call the like the Earth Alliance or this Earth vessel, and they keep using the term Earth, and the fact that they bring up like Earth Woman. Oh yeah, Spock. I think this might be the first time. I can't remember if they mentioned it Where No Man Has Gone before, because it's been a while that Spock was half human. They may have mentioned it in Where No Man Has Gone before. But if not, this would have been the first time they mentioned, because Spock mentions that he has an Earth woman as a mother. See, in later Star Trek they would just say humans, but here in this episode they kept saying Earth people. Oh, we're the Earth Alliance, this Earth woman, whatever. So it was the show really like finding its footing and not trying to figure out what it was. Plus, here's the thing. Like, I think this is an interesting premise for the show, and I did watch it on Netflix, which has like the enhanced special effects that they did in the early 2000s, which I think actually helps this episode a lot, because a lot had to do with how huge that ship was, and of course in the original 60s version it was just like a ball that someone put lights on, like a disco ball. Maybe I'm being too harsh, but in the early 2000s, they used early 2000s CGI, which still isn't the best by modern standards, but it's definitely a lot better than the disco ball that they used in the 60s. And so I think it actually helps this episode a lot too, because I'm actually intimidated by this ship that has the Enterprise trap. But funny thing, even in this enhanced 2000s version, the probe, they kind of still seems like a glowing Rubik's cube. Like they didn't really enhance that very much. It still looks very 60s-ish. Anyway, so in this episode, they discovered this probe, or no, a buoy of some kind that attaches itself to them, and it starts leaking radiation, and Kirk is like freaking out, and they're trying to figure out how to get out of it, and how they try to just back away, but it follows them, and it starts emanating this radiation that's going to kill him, so Kirk has no choice but to destroy it. And at this point, they're like, oh, should we go back? Should we go forward? And Kirk's like, our mission is to explore. So they go forward, and then the alien ship says, you destroyed our warning buoy, so now we'll destroy you. It's like, I think there was another episode similar to this. I think it was Spectre of the Mine, or Spectre of the Gun, sorry, in season 3, where Kirk had a similar attitude where he's like, oh, fuck warning. He just ignores aliens' warning to stay out of their space, and it's like, we're explorers. And it's like, well, no, you still gotta respect. I mean, if you expect to meet and have peaceful relations with other aliens, you gotta respect their wishes and respect their boundaries. And if they say go away, you'd be like, no, we're out to explore. Of course, you're gonna get face consequences, and they're going to be hostile towards you. Like, that's idiotic. So I felt like it was kind of a similar situation here, whereas you had this buoy that attached itself to you and nearly killed your ship, and it was obviously advanced technology and obviously hostile, and it was just like, no, we're going to go forward anyway. It's like, dumbass. He kind of deserved what he got next. But anyway, and of course the other signature of this episode is that it had that weird alien thing, which is funny because it's very reminiscent of what we think of as aliens now, and from real life stories of alien abduction or whatever. You have that typical sort of alien, and it kind of looks like that, but to my knowledge, all that didn't really become highly popularized or part of the cultural mindset until the 80s and 90s. So this predates that, and it's funny that it looks so similar to it anyway. Maybe there were some examples of it even back then, but I don't know. But of course it's just a puppet that the Balak, who just looks like a little kid, was using to fool them. And so that's very classic and a very signature move. And then you also have this storyline with this lieutenant named Bailey, who you don't see again, and the episode actually explains why, because he goes off with Belloc on the mission of cultural exchange or whatever. But the way they handle his character is kind of, I don't buy it. Like, I think it's very sloppy writing that because he becomes a terrible officer. But through the dialogue between Kirk and McCoy, they try to explain, oh, he's just under pressure. Kirk's pushing him too far. But this is where the show not tell things, because they're telling us this, but they're showing us someone who's plainly incompetent and doesn't deserve to be on that bridge at all. But they're telling us that he is very competent and a good officer. It's just that he's under pressure and Kirk's pushing him too far. That's not what they show us, though. They show us someone who's an idiot and doesn't deserve to be there. But, that's just my interpretation. Anyway, let me get into the heart of my complaint about this episode. Is I don't buy that ending at all. And in fact, I think that ending is ridiculous. Because the alien buoy nearly poisoned the whole crew, and they had the Enterprise captured by this huge, massive alien ship, and they were set a countdown for 10 minutes. I didn't really like the funny way in which they made the aliens talk to. You may have deities or deities, so we will grant you 10 of your time units you refer to as units, or your Earth time. Yeah, I just hated that. I guess that's also reminiscent of the 60s, but not every original series episode had them talk like that. It's just, that bothered me. But anyway, what really bothered me is the fact that, they were threatening the ship the whole entire time, and that Kirk and all of his crew were going through trauma where they all believed they were going to die, and they were suffering the trauma of this is our last minutes alive. And plus, they would react in extreme ways to try to prevent their own deaths. And they would do drastic things that maybe they would actually kill themselves. Maybe they would try blowing something up that would risk killing them, but they were so, they had nothing to lose at that point, because as far as they were concerned, they were all about to die. And then we learned, it's just a test. Ha ha ha. Let's sit down and have drinks together. Bullshit. Bullshit. That's not how that works. You don't tell. And plus, Kirk and everyone's reactions, oh, you're just testing us. Oh, fine. No, Kirk should have been what the fuck, dude? We thought we were gonna die. We suffered trauma. We could have killed ourselves trying to prevent that. But he didn't bring any of that up. Instead, he's let's just have some drinks. No, that is not how that works. That is not how that would turn out. And why the hell? And it's just this. To me, it's sloppy writing. It's I think they wrote, personally, it's all speculation, but I think they wrote this episode that was really intense, but they couldn't come up with a way to end it. And they were what if it was just this wacky kid all along who was just testing them? Oh, fine, I can't think of any other ending. Let's just go with that. Because it doesn't fit. And it's the thing about this episode is I actually think it's really good. Really intense, seeing how they would react to this death situation where death is imminent, and seeing the different. I think this is actually one of the better original series episodes as far as seeing the different character interactions between the different various crew members. And it's funny because this was the second episode that Sulu seems more prominent and even Uhura in some cases, and that you get this bridge crew interactions that a lot of the later episodes wouldn't do. Yeah, I still think when we get to the ending, and just no, I just did not an ounce of me buys that. I think that is terrible writing. And also, I gotta say, in the scene where they did have Belloc, who was just played by a kid, but definitely voiced by an adult, you can tell, especially because it was made in the 60s, you can tell that the voice is not coming out of that person's mouth, that it was put in there in post-production, and it's very obvious, very jarring. Like every time he talked, especially when he laughed, it's just like it was like, yeah, it was basically like watching a foreign movie that's been dubbed in English, but except only one character's doing it where everyone else around them is normal, which makes it a lot worse. And so it's so distracting and off-putting, even though I try to put all this stuff aside, set allowances for the original series, which at this stage is like over 60 years old. Wow. I'm so old. And then there's the whole thing about the Cobramite Maneuver itself, Kirk's sort of bluff. And I did like this scene a lot, especially the way, when Kirk asked Spock for options, and he was like, well, it's like chess. Someone makes a move, a counter move, and then they have you trapped, checkmate. And Kirk's like, I don't accept that. And then later he's like, not chess, Spock, poker. And then he comes up with this bluff, the Corbomite Maneuver, and was able to outwit the aliens and prevent their deaths that way. Of course, this is all undermined by the fact that we learned it was just some kid testing him, which again is bullshit. But I still like that scene a lot, although they did telegraph that a bit too much when McCoy was talking about Bailey, whatever, and he said something like, and that's no bluff, and Kirk is really pissed off. Anytime you can bluff me, Doctor. Like, that dialogue actually doesn't make sense on its own. It's too obvious that it's there to set up the concept of poker, and that's what gives Kirk the idea, poker. but other than that, I did actually really like that scene. So, my rating for the Cobramite Maneuver out of 10 is a 7. Very good. Even though it has like some obvious, seriously flaws with the ending and the way that the story comes together, it was still a really good episode. One I really enjoyed watching. As I said, the character interactions between them worked. Particularly, I like the Kirk and McCoy because this is the first time. It is, regardless of fucking Netflix or IMDb, this says this is the first time they have that McCoy actually appears and they have that Kirk-McCoy dynamic. And I think they do a good job of explaining exactly what kind of relationship they have. And so, yeah, it's still an enjoyable episode to watch, even though that ending makes me angry. So, that's it for my review of the Cobramite Maneuver. I shall be back to review many more episodes of Star Trek. So be sure to check out my channel for that, and also check out my channel as I cover many other shows like The Expanse, Breaking Bad, The Outer Limits, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all that. And thanks a lot for watching.